Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome everyone. This is episode number 127 of Warbird Tube, and tonight we take a look at a pivotal point in World War II history, the sinking of the German battleship the Bismarck. But we're going to go beyond just that story and bring in some other elements that will kind of elevate things to a new level. We'll talk more about that as we get going. But before we get started, if you could do us a favor, if you haven't already done so, and I know many of you have, and thank you, but just take a second to like, share, and subscribe, and make sure you follow us. And if you're on YouTube and you subscribe, also click the bell icon, and you'll get notifications about new episodes of Warbird Tube when they go live. Now, as you're watching tonight, you may have some questions. Just type those in the chat box, and we'll answer them either during the presentation if we can, or we'll definitely have time at the end before we sign off. So joining us now is Konley Kelley, the education officer from the CAF B-29, B-24 squadron. Con, welcome to the program.
Thanks. It's great to be back, Steve, and
yes,
welcome to the presentation Sink to Bismarck.
Yeah.
I thought it also might be nice for some of us in really hot places right now this summer to go to the frigid North Atlantic for the evening. So that's my thinking behind it. But it's great to be back. Been a while since I've done a session. Steve, Leah, and Blaine do such a great job with Warbird Tube, and I think you're archiving so many videos now. It's just a wonderful resource for history buffs and Warbird enthusiasts like me. So thank you. I'm glad to be a part of it.
Good. Well, let's dive on in.
All right. Just trying to advance. There we go. Advancing my slide. So I joined the CAF and everybody in 2010, and I'm a member of the B-29, B-24 squadron. As Steve mentioned, the education officer is my role right now, and that means I plan activities, part of that for the local members in Dallas, and do other special projects for the squadron. So this spring I was looking for historic anniversaries of World War II, and 80 years ago was the Dam Busters raid, the famous low-level bombing mission by Lancaster bombers from 617 Squadron with the ingenious bouncing bomb made by Barnes Wallace. And so I was interested in that, and I contacted the first British Flying Training Museum, which is in Lancaster, Terrell, Texas, and they have all the documents on the cadets that went through that school in World War II. And I was wondering if anyone joined the 617 Squadron, and sure enough, they did. This squadron also was a big part of the mission in December '44 that destroyed the battleship Tirpitz, which was the sister ship to the Bismarck. So as we talked, I invited them perhaps to come speak to us. We're still working that out. But I know a lot about the Bismarck, so I offered in turn to come do a presentation on the Bismarck. But I had to make one, so this is a great reason to do it, and I think you'll enjoy it. I really hope so. This is our agenda for the night, and like Steve said, I want to talk to how you can take a story from history and take it to the next level. For me, this started in the 1970s when I was a 10-year-old kid. So we're going to talk about that and cover the Bismarck in more of an overview, general overview, but I think it'll be enough to intrigue you if you don't know a lot about the story. And then we're going to go into some of the popular culture pieces related to that, movies and music and art and research being done on games. But my focus really is going to, toward the end, will be on scale and 3D modeling, which is how I enjoy doing this. I call this taking it to the next level. And so I got a slide on that. I think all of us, in whatever capacity we look at World War II and other parts of history, we take it to the next level in many different ways. I just made a rough list here. And if you look through it, some of it from beginning to end, from reading books down to making it your life's work, a lot of us do this, and it just happens to be, what we're most interested in, what matters to us. On the side are a few of mine. I'm a CAF member, of course, and I'm crew member Fifi and Diamond Lil. So I've flown on the planes and done ground school, and that's definitely an example. And there's my friend Lisa Foster. She's a living history Rosie, and she wished me luck tonight. So she does that as part of her personal mission to look back and celebrate history. And then I know it's future history, but I'm a Trekker, a Star Trek guy. And so I have my collection of stuff, and I have a picture of my wife, who's also a Trekker, and cosplay costume. And then we went for Valentine's Day to see Wrath of Khan and William Shatner. That's what you do on Valentine's Day, right? So, and then lastly, the Titanic. My daughter and I share an interest in Titanic. We've seen the traveling display, and I made a 3-foot model of the Titanic for her. So some of these might apply to you, or multiple bullet points here might apply to you. So let's go back to 1976, where this really started for me. So I'm from California, that country out on the left coast. I sometimes say I'm from another country, but I love living there as a kid and being close to Yosemite Valley in the city of Madera, which is in the Central Valley of California, the gateway, as they would call it, to Yosemite. And so it's a small farm town, about 20,000 people live there, one McDonald's, one small airport, not much there, but mostly a farm town. And this is me, believe it or not, 10 years old. I was a terrible athlete, blind as a bat, no girlfriend, but I was an outstanding scale modeler. And I have some pictures at the bottom of the glue and the paints we used. The warning labels really weren't as big a deal back then. So I hope I haven't done something I'll regret one day. But I had an income. I was a paper boy, and I really did ride a bike like this, had the pouch with the papers on the front and the back, threw them on people's lawns. Once in a while, I'd hit their porch. I don't know where the dog came in. This is not me, but I had an income, so I had money. What did I spend my money on? Well, like every kid at 10 years old, I spent on model kits or tropical fish from my aquarium. And I did have my friends over, and I didn't blow up and burn up a lot of my masterpieces, but from time to time we did. We'd make a show of it in what we call the war zone in our backyard. And then when it came to entertainment back then, it was a lot different. I don't think kids really get that, because we had maybe 6 TV channels. We had the 3 networks. We had Sesame Street channel, and then we had Spanish language channel, but we had one independent channel, and this is all broadcast TV, and it was channel 26. And I would get the TV guide at the beginning of the week. Remember that TV guide? And I would plan my whole week around movies I wanted to see. And I loved all the war movies back then. And these are some great classic films. I know you've seen them many times. I've seen them many, many times, and even quote parts of them. And Midway I saw in the theater in 1976 in Sense Around. And that was an experiment with a couple different movies back then that had explosions or earthquakes. And they would rig the theater to shake when an explosion went off. But they ended it once they started finding cracks in the theater. And Steve, I didn't put your favorite one up there. I know it's Operation Petticoat.
Oh, of course.
Steve and I were laughing earlier. We used to get the Sears catalog back then, and you'd plan all your Christmas gifts around getting that in October. This is my greatest Christmas gift ever, the Guns of Never Own playset from Mark's Toys, and it came with a bunch of German soldiers. And because I was a paper boy, we always had a lot of rubber bands around, and we'd put the soldiers on the Guns of Never Own playset and pick them off with rubber bands. This thing goes for about $800 on eBay now. Back then it was $15, so things have gone up in price, obviously. And then we had a great airport for air shows in Madera, and so we had air shows back then. And what was really cool about being in Madera in the 70s is there's a hot TV show called Blah Blah Black Sheep with Robert Conrad on TV once a week. Of course, Heroes Fighting Zeros. Pappy Boyington, up until his death, lived in Fresno, so if he was able to, he'd be at that air show. So we had Pappy Boyington at that air show during Blah Blah Black Sheep. And I know we had some CAF birds like Sentimental Journey in that picture. And I flew in a B-25. So obviously I was getting inspired to the next level. But one movie really sunk in, and pardon the pun, and that was the Sink the Bismarck movie from 1960. And I remember watching the movie, building the model kits. But I think it'd be great if Mr. Blaine at the controls can roll the trailer for us. Roll it, Blaine.
I'm Admiral. The time was May 1941. Britain stood alone. Convoy sinkings were increasing when Bismarck, the most powerful battleship in the world, broke out into the Atlantic and sank the Hood. Bismarck had to be sunk if Britain was to survive. Winston Churchill gave the order.
I don't care how you do it. You must sink the Bismarck.
This is how it was done.
We gotta sink the Bismarck to the bottom of the sea. They find a German battleship that's making such a fuss.
Officers and men of the Bismarck, this is the fleet commander. I can now tell you that we are going out into the North Atlantic to attack the British convoy system. We are sailing in the largest, the most powerful battleship afloat. We are faster, we are unsinkable, and we are German.
The Battle of the North Atlantic was on as battleships and cruisers went after the Bismarck in the greatest sea hunt in history. At the Admiralty's Operation Division, men and their ships were moved like pawns in a ceaseless game of chess, and it was anyone's guess who would call checkmate.
Hey, Founder, picture up in the Denmark Strait. Bismarck and a heavy cruiser.
Director of Operations was Captain Shepard, a man who'd seen much action and known great personal tragedy.
My son's missing. His plane ran out of fuel. I didn't think it was possible to feel such pain.
You can't avoid pain by fencing yourself off. Sometimes you need the help of other people more than anything else. But you have to let them get close enough to help.
Working alongside him, a young Wren officer who tried to break through the barrier of cold officialdom to the heart of the man.
I thought that surely you must be married or something.
I was going to be married last year, but it didn't work out. He was at Dunkirk. He was a rather wonderful man. Not brilliant or dashing or anything like that, but just rather wonderful.
Also starring Carl Moner as Captain Lindemann of the Bismarck. Sink the Bismarck is a shattering emotional film of men and ships that brings back with overwhelming excitement and realism the defeats and the despair, the triumphs and the glory of a naval action that helped to destroy Hitler's Germany.
We have to sink the Bismarck, cause the world depends on us.
We hit the deck a-running and we spun those guns around.
We found the mighty Bismarck and then we cut her down.
Thank you, Blaine. It was fun to watch. And we'll look at some trivia from that movie a little later, but let's go ahead and start talking about the Bismarck by looking at some historical figures, and I'll walk you through the history. This is the Bismarck, massive battleship. As you can see, it's the largest battleship afloat of its kind back then, and you can see just a floating fortress. To the right and left are the badge and the crest of the Bismarck. Definitely the most powerful in the German Navy and the pride of the Kriegsmarine when it went to sea. The Battle of the North Atlantic, back then, of course, it was very dire for the Allies. We had, we weren't in the war yet, but we were sending convoys of supplies and materials to Great Britain. Really, we were their lifeline at the time. And you can see from the stats that U-boats were wreaking havoc on the convoys, with the peak being between roughly 1940 and up to 42. Until later, they had some technology and tactics to fight back at the U-boats. But there also were surface ships that were attacking the convoys, and you don't hear about them as much, but there were some pretty devastating losses from surface ships, including in the bottom corners, the German battleship Scharnhorst. And these surface ships could fire shells from up to 15 miles away at enemy or target ship, and the Allied ships in these convoys had no way of defending themselves. So in fact, the Scharnhorst is recorded hitting aircraft carrier, the Glorious, British aircraft carrier, from over 15 miles away in World War II. So if you've seen Greyhound, the Tom Hanks movie, that's a really, I think, good depiction. It came out 2020 of early days of the convoy system and the escorts trying to protect the convoys and the desperate measures they had to take. And that was written by C.S. Forrester, who wrote it. It was called The Good Shepherd, who also wrote the account of the Bismarck, which the 1960 film is based on. Bismarck's was launched, it was built in Hamburg, and then the hull was launched on February 14th, 1939. It was commissioned August 24th, 1940. And there was a treaty after World War I. The nations could not build warships over 35 tons. When the Bismarck was put to sea, her displacement was 52,600 tons. So I don't think the Germans read that treaty. The Bismarck on deck. This is an interesting vignette of pictures of the Bismarck superstructure, which really is a distinctive look to it. It's heavily armored. And you can see one of the turrets of the Bismarck. It's funny, I'm in the CAF squadron, and we have 4 engines on our B-29, and they're named after movie starlets. To tell them apart, you have Betty, Rita, Mitzi, and Ingrid. Well, the German Battleship Bismarck had 4 guns, and they were named to tell them apart. From the bow to stern, they had Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora. So if you're a scale modeler or 3D modeler, massing photos like this when you're going to start a project, it's just essential. It's essential to the modeling project for the painting and the construction, the decaling. I have a number of walk-around books, some about the Bismarck and other subjects that interest me. And then there are a lot of YouTube videos. Our squadron has some on our bombers if you've never checked them out. So the Bismarck is launched and outfitted on December 31st. Captain Ernst Lindemann assumes command. By that time, she'd gone through one period of sea trials, and she goes through another period of sea trials in early 1941. And it's at that time, for the second sea trial, that she gets her famous camouflage, which is the black and white striping you see on the side. She also had a dark, you can see the coloring on the bow and the stern, and then what they call false bow wave and a false stern wave. This was to try to deceive enemy spotters as to the length of the ship or the speed of the ship. And then on the upper deck, on the forward and aft section, she had a big red swastika, which was for aerial recognition, of course. So her Baltic exercises ended and completed in May 14, and she's ready for her first combat operation. But before that, on May 5th, you had Adolf Hitler, you had Field Marshal Keitel, and Fleet Commander Admiral Gunther Lütjens and their staff toured the Bismarck and inspected the ship. And Lütjens and his staff would remain aboard for the sortie into the North Atlantic. Operation, Steve and I were talking about this, Ring-a-bung. I need to, I'm gonna pronounce, I've always just called it the Bismarck operation. But anyway, this is the name of the German operation that the Bismarck carried out, her one and only operation. So May 18th, Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, left the safety of Norway to break out into the North Atlantic and attack the convoy system, Britain's lifeline to America. The action was of great concern to the British Admiralty because they had warships all over different theaters of combat, were spread really thin. For something like this to happen would just be traumatic. They just couldn't spare more ships. And then it was proven, it was documented by a reconnaissance Spitfire with British Coastal Command, took some aerial photos at 15,000 feet of the Bismarck and Tirpitz making their way out of a fjord in Norway. And then there was some weather that set in. It was hard to track the Bismarck. They lost track of her, actually. And what was problematic was in escaping from where they were, there are 4 different routes that they could take. And so the British had to go with every contingency plan to be on those routes. So if they spotted the Bismarck, they could direct ships to that to battle the Bismarck and prevent them getting to the convoy lane. So in the Denmark Strait, which is up near Greenland, you'll see it on the next map, you had the heavy cruisers HMS Suffolk and Norfolk keeping watch. So this is kind of a spoiler alert, but this is a really good map of Operation Rheinbung. And you can see the red line represents the German warships, Bismarck and Prince Eugen, and I don't have a laser pointer, but you can see the coast of Greenland where the action's about to take place, the Battle of Denmark Strait, and then the route Bismarck took heading back to France. You hear all about that. But see, that's a lot of ocean to cover. So once they spotted the Bismarck, they had to take action. Battle of Denmark Strait. This is the key moment in the history of the Bismarck and the ships in the battle that duked it out when they ran across each other in Denmark Strait. This is one of the most iconic pictures from World War II. It's the Bismarck firing on the Prince of Wales and silhouetted by the blast of her guns. So there are 4 primary combatants, and we're going to look, and I got a nice little chart here where you can see the specifications of the ship. It's not too complicated. or long, but this has the main things I thought you ought to know. So once they were in the Denmark Strait, the Bismarck, I'm looking at the Bismarck specifications. She had 8 15-inch guns, we mentioned them, and then 12 5.9-inch guns in her secondary battery, and it was the most heavily armed warship at the Denmark Strait conflict. Then you had the Prince Eugen, which is about half the size of the Bismarck. Remarkably, had this, kind of the same silhouette as the Bismarck, and also heavily armed, just not as armed as the Bismarck, with 8 8-inch guns and 12 4.1-inch secondary battery. Then you had the Hood. The Hood was the most beloved British warship. She was built in World War I. She was a symbol of the Royal Navy and did a lot of gunboat diplomacy between wars. But she was about to trade salvos with the most modern warship afloat. And unfortunately, the Hood was in line for some upgrades to her armor plating and weapons in 1941, but this hadn't happened yet. So at the time of the battle, she was still a formidable warship, but she was outclassed by the more modern Bismarck. Then you had a brand new British warship at Denmark Strait, the HMS Prince of Wales. Very capable battleship, quite well armed. You can see she had 10 14-inch guns. And the turrets, you can see there are 4 nozzles on each turret. And then quite an impressive secondary armament. But when she left port, she had they're still working out the kinks, and she left port to go and be in this engagement with mechanics still aboard. So she was untested. Here's some photos from the actual battle, and you can see, I know they're grainy with this best you got from World War II, but you can see the giant splashes from the shells. And this is 14 and 15-inch shells streaking across the sky in an arc and crashing and making shells. And it allowed the rangefinders on the ships and the crew targeting the weapons to bracket the ships, and then it would get better chance at a direct hit. And there were hits on both sides. You'll see the hits in the next slide, and all the ships, mainly the Bismarck and the Hood, were duking it out. But the Prince of Eugen was also engaged, as was the Prince of Wales. But it was the 5th salvo from Bismarck that doomed the Hood. One of her was a plunging fire, they called it. One of her projectiles penetrated the Hood right in front of the main mast in a lightly armored area, plunged down to the armor magazine and exploded. And this created a chain reaction explosion that literally blew the ship in 2 pieces. And the Hood started sinking immediately. And it's almost wild to think of it, but the bow was pointing straight toward the sky, and the forward gun crew, they knew they were doomed, fired off one more blast from their gun crew. But the Prince of Wales, being right astern of the Hood, had to quickly dodge her to avoid the wreckage. Let's see if that's it. And then the Bismarck and the Prince of Wales and the Prince Eugen started firing on the Prince of Wales. So she was outnumbered at that point by guns, and she took many hits. You'll see in the next slide. And there was a deadly hit to the bridge, in fact. And so Captain Leach, the Prince of Wales, said, "Make smoke," and he retreated. So here's a diagram of the tracks of battle with the Bismarck and Prince Eugen at the top, and then at the bottom, the Hood and Prince of Wales. And that little knob at the top is where the Hood was sunk. You can see the red marks are the shell hits, the direct hits on the battleships. Prince of Wales took a lot of hits. You can see the shot in front of the main mast that doomed the Hood. Now, the Hood, the Prince Bismarck did not get away unscathed. That shot in the bow was right at the waterline, and she started flooding and losing oil from a puncture to that tank. So that was a problem for the Bismarck, and that ended the mission to attack the convoy lane. She needed to go back and get repaired. And so she separated from Prince Eugen and started heading back to France and shook off the Norfolk and Suffolk, which were trying to track her. So with the bad weather and no more Bismarck, the hunt for the Bismarck began. This is, oh, I jumped a little bit ahead. This is a last photo of the Hood and Captain Leach's eyewitness drawing of the Hood's explosion, and a really famous painting by J.C. Schmitz of it's in the Library of Congress, of the Hood going down. So you can see the Hood split apart and her bow pointing toward the air. Here's the hard reality of what happened. The Hood had 1,418 men aboard. only 3 men survived the blast, and almost amazing they'd survive in the icy North Atlantic and with exposure, whatever injuries they had. And their accounts, I read a few this week, are just harrowing of what they saw on that ship. But the loss of life is just hard to imagine. Here's the Bismarck damage. So she's down at the bow, and this is the last picture of the Prince Eugen, from the Prince Eugen of the Bismarck before they separated. So you can see the Bismarck's in a little bit of trouble, but still maneuverable, making speed. Winston Churchill says, every ship at our disposal needs to hunt the Bismarck and sink the Bismarck. So that was what the Admiralty, it mentioned them, the planners behind everything back in London, had decided that they had to pull ships from other theaters of combat, and they sent out as much aerial reconnaissance as they could to try to find the Bismarck. At the time, we were engaged in the Lend-Lease Act with Great Britain. We were neutral, United States, but we had a few things going on behind the scenes, and we sent some PBYs over, I think, to get 20 or so to be available to the British for their needs. And we had 3 pilots go over too, and they were training the British pilots. Well, one of them ended up being the pilot on the PBY that spotted the Bismarck. So that had to get kept secret. He got the Distinguished Flying Cross, but he couldn't tell anybody why. And the Bismarck had been spotted, so plans were made to attack the Bismarck. And so part of the deployment of ships to attack the Bismarck included 2 aircraft carriers. And imagine, this is May 1941, aircraft carrier technology and flying and all the everything that is involved in landing on a carrier. It's compounded by the terrible weather conditions up in the North Atlantic. And then on top of that, the Victorious, which you can see some swordfish on the deck there, and the Ark Whirl in this picture, they were equipped with some obsolete airplanes that of the time, including their primary weapon airplane being the ferried Swordfish, which was the mainstay of the Royal Navy at the time. So that's what they had at the disposal, and they employed using the Swordfish once they had the Bismarck's location. It really was the only way they could even catch the Bismarck, because the Royal Navy was in pursuit, but so far behind, and the Bismarck was still making good speed, they never would have been able to catch up, and they would have ran out of fuel. So the only way to stop the Bismarck was to somehow, with torpedoes, disable the ship. And the ferry Swordfish was an obsolete biplane, carried a torpedo, but it was used throughout World War II by the British right until the end of the war. It was nicknamed the string bag because it could carry any type of military armament or signaling device, whatever's under the wing there. It could carry just about anything, so it's called the string bag. And it played an eventual role, as we're going to find out, in the destruction of the Bismarck, but it also had astonishing success in an attack on the capital ships from the Italian Navy that were anchored in Taranto. And those 2 missions and the role of aerial attacks on large ships were what the Japanese were watching from afar as they were making plans to attack Pearl Harbor. So here's a really awesome shot. You can barely see it, but the one of the Swordfish seeing the Bismarck through the cloud cover. So there were 2 attacks, I think, on the Bismarck, and there were torpedo hits, but the Bismarck had special plating, I think double bulkhead. So one bulkhead was hit, torpedo would explode, and the inner bulkhead wouldn't be damaged. So she really was almost indestructible, at least in their thinking, from torpedo attack. But her Achilles heel was her rudder. And one of the Swordfish pilots got a lucky shot off and hit Bismarck's rudder. And at the time, she was zigzagging so much that her rudder was caught at an extreme angle and jammed so bad by the explosion they couldn't free the rudder. The other thing that was kind of interesting about what happened was the movie depicts a couple of the Swordfish shot down, but no Swordfish were shot down by the Bismarck. And you think a plane that's barely flying 100, 120 miles an hour like that in a steady line could be easy to shoot. But the Bismarck was also weaving back and forth and had modern weaponry that really wasn't able to target these slow-moving planes. For some reason, they just couldn't hit them. So that was an interesting thing for the greatest warship afloat not be able to shoot down any biplanes. I call it a David and Goliath story. This was a plane made of fabric, 5,500 pounds, attacking a 50,200 ton warship, and really the death blow was to her anchored by a swordfish. So the Bismarck basically can't maneuver, and it's just making a wide circle because it just can't free its rudder. It can't go back to France. And that enabled the British fleet to catch up to the Bismarck, including a few more capital ships in the British fleet. You can see in the map the arrow indicating how close the Bismarck had gotten to France before the Swordfish attack. The Rodney is a wild-looking ship. I've always found that interesting. All the weaponry, turrets are on the front of the ship. And the KG-5 was Admiral Tovey's ship. And it was much like the same model as the Prince of Wales. And there's a Dorsetshire heavy cruisers. So there was a lot of really good a lot of ships ready to take on the Bismarck. She couldn't maneuver. She was an easy target, and they started pummeling her with shots on the 27th of May. And eventually, as I was telling Steve earlier, I don't know, the Bismarck when it lost a couple of turrets and it really couldn't fight back. The British ships even got in closer, and they were at one point firing straight line shots into the superstructure of the Bismarck. But she wouldn't sink, and that was probably because they were just ripping apart chunks of armor, but not any death blows to the below the waterline or into the deck of the ship. So with the Bismarck was a burning hulk, and there's an order for the Dorsetshire to fire torpedoes to sink her, and the Dorsetshire did that. It fired 6 torpedoes, and it was in Bismarck sunk. And now there are 2,200 men on the Bismarck, and who knows how many made it overboard and weren't killed by the blast and the destruction, the shrapnel on the ship. So the Dorsetshire was ordered to pick up the survivors in the water, and they started to pick them up, and then somebody spotted a U-boat. There's a U-boat threat in the area, of course. They were close to France. So the Dorsetshire had to leave the area in order to not be caught as a sitting duck. And only, I think I wrote it down. Oh, here we go. I didn't get to the next slide. I apologize. Here's the Rodney firing on the Bismarck, and then the Bismarck on fire. So out of 2,200 men on the Bismarck, only 114 survived. Another terrible loss of life. So time's good, Steve. So let's fast forward to close to the present day. Robert Ballard, who found the Titanic, his next mission was to locate the Bismarck. And he found the Bismarck on June 8th, 1989, using much of the same technology that he used to find the Titanic. She's about, I think, 3,000 feet deeper than the Titanic, about 470 miles west of Brest, France. And I actually saw him at a lecture, and he had just found the Yorktown off Midway, and I had my Bismarck book, and he signed both of them. But he's, of course, I heard James Cameron's coming in a minute, and he said he just follows Robert Ballard around because he's found so many undersea warships and wrecks. But this is from National Geographic. And then Ken Marshall, who painted a lot of the Titanic pictures you might have seen, he painted some visions of what the Bismarck looked like underwater, and you can see the armament next to the Bismarck there. And the corrosion, they had to cover the swastika, and I think they used a tarp to cover it, if I'm not mistaken. So the swastika couldn't be seen from air during combat, but then all that would have disappeared when the ship sunk. So the swastika is still present on the deck of the Bismarck, 15,700 feet down. And because the ship, I mentioned this, Cameron, I think, proved in his expedition, the Bismarck was scuttled. And he could prove that by some damage they saw to the bottom of the ship and off the bottom sides of the ship, the way it had blown out, and also the way the ship settled and the way it flooded. So that's why the ship's in pretty good condition. So that's anyway, that's the probably just the truth now is Bismarck was scuttled by the German crew aboard. So Bismarck had a sister ship, the Tirpitz, and I talked about that earlier in relation to the British Flying School. The Tirpitz didn't really engage in much combat. It only fired its guns in combat once in its entire career. It was mainly just a threat that the Germans kept up in Norway to intimidate the Allies, because that was the passage to get supplies, munitions, and so forth to Russia. So just having the Tirpitz there created such a threat that they had to deal with it, and they had to make plans to try to destroy the Tirpitz in a fjord in Norway. And there were a lot of inventive ways to do this, including British midget submarines that actually had somewhat a successful mission where they damaged the Tirpitz. And I think at that point, one of the missions damaged her so badly, she really couldn't be in a combat operation anymore. But the 617 Squadron, and another squadron called the Squadron 9, I think I have my notes here, they made several bombing missions of the Bismarck, and Barnes Wallace, who made that bouncing bomb, made a 12,000-pound bomb called a Tall Boy. And you can see a man in that picture with a Tall Boy. This, you can see it from being dropped by a Lancaster, massive bomb. And when they dropped these on the Tirpitz, she was hit by a few bombs, but one bomb hit the sandbar that she was on. Anyway, the destruction was so massive, she just capsized and sank. So that was the end of the Tirpitz. And so you can see her wrecked in Norway. I don't know what's been scavenged, but there's still part of the hull, I think, remaining. And then the other capital ships from the Bismarck story, we have the Prince of Wales with the Hood. The Prince of Wales served up until this moment in December, and I think was even a point where I think Roosevelt and Churchill and maybe Stalin met on the ship at one point to make war plans before the United States was in the war. But she was caught on December 10th, can you believe this, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, with the battleship Repulse, and sunk by Betty bombers carrying torpedoes. So a battleship caught out in the open again, and some people have said this moment and the Bismarck moment and Pearl Harbor all ended kind of the reign of the battleship. Then you have the Ark Royal that launched the Swordfish that torpedoed the Bismarck. She was sunk by a U-boat on November 11th, 1941. And the most interesting story of all probably is the Prince Eugen. She survived the war, fought in several different engagements in the war. She was somewhat effective, but at the end of the war was captured by the Allies and then towed from the Atlantic all the way through the Panama Canal, all the way up to Bikini Atoll, and anchored with several other warships for hydrogen bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. And then you have Test Able on July 1st, and hard to see, but there's some warships scattered about anchored. And then in the diagram, you can see where it's circled. The bomb blast is the black circle. You can see where the Prince Eugen was. So the first test was an atmospheric test. The second one was underwater. She survived both tests, and they towed her to Kwajalein. I hope I'm pronouncing all this right, Steve. I got to study my pronunciation. But they towed her there, and she sprung a leak, but because of all the danger of radioactivity on the ship, the leak ended up flooding the ship, and she turned over and capsized and sank. Bismarck's place in history and popular culture, the Johnny Horton song, which is in that trailer, but it wasn't really made for the movie. Johnny Horton was a folk singer. He sang ballads, and he wrote the song Sink to Bismarck. It made it to number 3 on the charts, and they ended up using it with the trailer in the United States because it was a fun, interesting little song, and they thought it might attract American audiences. And then World of Warships has these great games. You can match up the Bismarck against any battleship you want. Of course, modeling an RC, and there's even a Lego Bismarck. Like James Cameron's quote, you have to imagine a ship so powerful it could bring an entire nation to its knees. For me, the Bismarck was the Death Star. His expedition and the Nat Geo expedition by Ballard are free on YouTube. I recommend checking them out. The trivia about the movie is interesting too. Kenneth More was a very popular English actor in the 50s and 60s. In World War II, he served on the Victorious, which was the other aircraft carrier during the Bismarck engagement. In 1956, he played Sir Douglas Bader in a very good film, Douglas Bader, gotta get his name right, a very good film, Reach for the Sky. You know Douglas Bader's story. And then he played an officer in Sink the Titanic. And A Night to Remember in 1958, which also starred Lawrence Naismith, who played the first Sea Lord 2 years later in Sink the Bismarck. And then Jeffrey Keane, probably looks familiar. He played Minister of Defense in 6 Bond films. But the one to the right interests me a lot. Esmond Knight played Captain Leach in Sink the Bismarck, and he has to utter that the hood is blown up in the movie. Well, he was on the Prince of Wales as a gunnery officer during the engagement as a young sailor. And he was there was a blast that hit near him, hit several of his seamates were killed, and he was blinded. He lost an eye, and then he was able to recover sight in the other eye. Edward R. Murrow, who was our correspondent during the Blitz in London, famous for saying, "This is London," he appears as himself in the movie. So interesting trivia about the movie. So I'm going to razzle dazzle you a little bit with my next level approach to this, and that's 3D models. I enjoy making 3D models. I picked it up when I was at a film school in the 90s. I started using a program called Strata, which had made a very, very popular game called Myst back then. It was also the inspiration for Lost, very popular adventure game. And so I got pretty good at it. And I've carried this forward and used Strata and made models, mostly military subject matter, for a long time. So I have a new Mac. I'm using Strata again. I'm having a renaissance with my 3D. And so I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to make a few new models of using my Bismarck model. So this is all originally built using those plans, those walk-around books, anything I could find, even a model itself to help me make the model. So this is a 3D model of the Bismarck made in Strata. And I have made a very big, perfect, cool model of the Bismarck. And this is a Tamiya's Bismarck. It's a really nice ship. It retails for about $100 now, but it's a great kit. It's about 27 inches long. And I've also built a Missouri, so I've kind of got the little matchup with your Missouri and Bismarck there together. Here's another rendering of the Bismarck heading out to the North Atlantic. I'm always trying to tell the story in 3D. It's my idea of doing interactive storytelling, something I'm kind of exploring as something I'd like to do down the road. So, but this is a scale model of the hood, but I've used Photoshop. Photoshop's a great tool for working with this. You make the texture maps for your 3D models in Photoshop. This is a scale model put into a scene. I kind of made a little artsy of the hood about to engage the Bismarck at Denmark Strait. And here's the Battle of Denmark Strait. I was inspired by this painting, and I used to have the painter's name in bottom corner, so I liked his angle, so I used the same angle for my 3D ships, and I think it turned out pretty neat. So here you have more scale models. So you can get scale models. Airfix makes a bunch of them, different brands. You just need to look for what you want. Bigger the better, but depends on your shelf space. So I've made a Tamiya's Swordfish, which is one of the most complex models I've ever made. It's really a good model. Really fun to build. Came out wonderful. And then I've made the Ark Royal, and together with Photoshop, made the Ark Royal about the right size to launch the Swordfish in that diorama. And then you have in this one, scale model of a PBY, the one that Leonard Tuck Smith flew when he spotted the Bismarck, and then put in a Photoshop diorama with the 3D Bismarck. And then you have that Swordfish I showed you, and a Photoshop diorama with the 3D Bismarck, torpedoing the Bismarck. But then I did something kind of cool. Well, first of all, I have the PBY. I've made one for Midway. I've made a Black Cat PBY, so it wasn't too hard to re-texture map a PBY to make the Bismarck PBY. So you can see that in the picture. But I went online, I've never done this before, and I bought a model. I bought this Swordfish model for $15, and it showed up in my inbox, and all I had to do was texture map it. It's a really nice model. So I'm thinking about trying to sell some of my own models now. But I recreated that other scene with all 3D models this time. And here you see the fatal torpedo hit done in 3D. I really like how this turned out, and you can see, the models in the foreground, and then in the corner, and then you can see the sky and all the special effects added in with Photoshop. And so this is just an example of that. Here's the 3D model. Here's the background. That was made in a program called Bryce, and explosions and wake made in Photoshop, and then a model put together, the Bismarck firing a broadside. And this is a shot of the Bismarck steaming to her destiny, made in 3D, a more recent model I made. Turned out really nice. Okay, now we're about to watch some animations I made of the Tirpitz. It's kind of neat having the Bismarck model made, because she really isn't that different than the Bismarck and Tirpitz are very similar. So you can see the dazzle camouflage on the Tirpitz. So all I had to do was change the texture map. And then Blaine's going to show you some experimental 3D animations I was doing with the Tirpitz a while back. They look pretty good still. I ran it twice just in case you said, I want to see that again. But I used a pyromania to make the explosions from the Tirpitz guns. So just fun. I know where I can go. I want to go to the animation direction now with some of these models. And I also want to 3D print models. I've 3D printed one successfully so far. So might even buy a 3D printer one of these days. But so much you can do with 3D modeling. And I know it's got to be something more kids are doing in school and have opportunities to do. So this is great subject matter if they want to pick subject matter. I really enjoy this much better than the Warlocks and everything else from the dungeon game, dragon game. So this is my.
And it's interesting that obviously you've worked in 3D modeling for a while, but for many of us and for many of people who are in aviation today, we got started with plastic models, right? Or RC, and this is, as you said, it's the next level, and it's something that's probably a little more accessible and more in line with what younger people are thinking of today, because they're screen driven, right? So this would probably be more appealing than necessarily using the stinky glue and the stinky paint to try to make your models.
Not only have to buy the supplies, you have to have the patience.
Right.
I know I decorated my room with a lot of that paint, which doesn't come out of the carpet and everything else when I was a kid. I know my mom loved me for that. Maybe that's why when I got back from college, all the models had mysteriously vanished that I left at the house. So I know we're hitting Q&A. I've made some of the CAF birds as 3D models, and it's fun. So anyway, I also have I call it the CAF Ceiling Air Force. There's a picture. You got to hang up your models, of course. And then if you're MASH fans, this is taking MASH to the next level. And then more recent projects, Old Crow came out really nice. So this is now using the new software, my new Mac, and then made this for somebody who wanted a Corsair. So special order, and that's my grandpa name. Did I say it was grandpa? I don't know if I did. I just became a grandpa.
Yep, not too long ago.
Last thing, just a project I'm working on with Dave Klaus, who is one of those guys who had made this his life's work. The Pulaski Raid, and I'm helping him with that. Some 3D I made there. And then lastly, this is my last slide, Steve. Just resources. No better resource than that website. I actually have some art on that website too. I don't know if it's the same guy. The guy that started that website was the Bismarck expert back then about the time making models. Well, he ended up going with Cameron on one of the expeditions, dove on the Bismarck, but it looks like he's maybe sold it or passed it on to somebody else. And then some books about the Bismarck, but so much on YouTube, and you can see the movie for free. I'll probably watch it tonight. I can't get enough of it. It's just such a great movie. It's well done. I encourage you to watch it and study this, and that's pretty much it. I think we sunk the Bismarck tonight.
There we go. Well, and again, the way the Bismarck, Sink the Bismarck movie touched you and kind of helped form your your interest in that pivotal moment in history. You never know what's going to spark someone's interest. So, especially with all the things that are available online these days, dealing with history, it's amazing what someone may discover, and hopefully someone will dig a little deeper into the story of the Bismarck from what we've talked about tonight, because there
have been 5 expeditions so far, I read. 5 expeditions, 2 were ROV and 3 were manned, including the James Cameron expedition. Expedition Bismarck's on YouTube, and it's really good. It's more recent. It's a good one to watch. But.
And again, this is not. It is a pivotal moment in World War II history, but it also, as you mentioned, the Japanese High Command was looking at what was happening with the Bismarck and in Toronto, and helped form what would happen in Pearl Harbor just 6 months later. So, you can't just take one of these items in history and look at it isolated. It's all interconnected, and the more you start to unpeel the onion, the more you see all these connections, and the more fascinating all of these events become.
Yeah, well, I hope there's a movie about it. I mean, it's not really Titanic. I guess he stuck with Avatar, but I was always hoping somebody like a Cameron would make a movie. Some of the 3D art by a guy named Thomas Schmidt has appeared in some of the documentaries, and his ship is so photorealistic. There's also a really good dogfights episode about the Bismarck and the Hood, and I think the dogfights 3D looks pretty good, but it's just really dramatic, and maybe tailored more toward a younger audience too, that likes 3D and the eye candy and everything. So I think, and that's what I hope to do too, is create some more interactive storytelling pieces that might interest kids more in history if they can see it in a way that they're used to now,
Right. Yep. So we've got a couple of comments from the audience. Let's see. Oh, Richard mentioned that little trivia from the three crew who survived the sinking of the Hood. They were in the crow's nest, and that's how they avoided the explosion. And as they left the crow's nest, the officer stood back. He was one of the three who survived, and let the crew go first.
Yeah.
So an officer until the end.
Briggs was, I think, his name.
He
can still. He's so he's got major PTSD from that event.
Oh, sure.
I can't imagine what he witnessed. It just, and the fact that ship went down on it was the pride of the Royal Navy and Britain.
Yeah.
So, thank you, Richard.
Yeah. And another audience, Peter says, there was a war game by Avalon Hill Company back in the 60s called Bismarck. I didn't know that either.
Yeah. Well, the guy wrote a folk song, Johnny Horton, about the War of 1812. I mean, hey.
Yep. Johnny Horton, he had something with combat and history.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, so, I can't play computer games as much, Steve, because I get motion sickness. I think I told you that the last time.
Ah, okay. Let's see. John's wondering, he said, you stated that Bismarck had 15-inch guns, and he's trying to remember if the New Jersey had 16-inch guns. Did the Missouri class have?
I don't think so. I think, and we can Google this, but I think the Yamato had 16-inch guns, or maybe bigger. Yamato was the biggest battleship ever made. That'd be another good story. I just haven't made one in 3D yet, but and I forgot to mention, Stephen, I feel bad because I did talk to him. The Sky High Wing in Midland actually has a swordfish. It's on status.
Yeah, so I was going to mention that.
Swordfish.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm just looking up to see quickly if I can look up the what it is. No, it did have main battery, the Iowa class, which would be the New Jersey, Wisconsin, the Missouri, and I can't think of the last one. 16-inch guns, 9 16-inch guns.
Should know that. I was there not long ago to Missouri.
Yeah. So, thank you, John. All right, those are the questions that we have from the audience tonight. Con, what's I know you're working on some interactive educational things, and especially the Pulaski raid. We had David on as a guest last year. Fascinating presentation. I can't imagine how is that coming along working with him.
Well, it's the 80th anniversary of the Pulaski raid. It was August 1st.
Yeah.
And he's hardcore. I think he may have said this in the interview. He had drones fly the track that the bombers flew toward the refineries. He has footage of that. He really makes great decals. He's got his own decal line for modelers. In fact, he made decals for the Devotion planes. So I bought some decals so I could make Jesse Brown's plane, his Corsair. So that's one way I know he makes money. But he's made decals for 30 and profiles of 30 of the primary aircraft. And so if we do something like that, our idea generally is to do it maybe like the Titanic display you maybe have been to Branson and seen it, but you would become a crew member on one of the bombers, and then maybe at the end find out if you made it or not. But we got a proposal out there, and we'll see what we can do with CAF or something like that. But one way or the other, he's going to crank out a documentary, and it'll be that ultimate documentary or website or whatever. And he's got his website. I had it on a slide earlier. I guess it'll be in the recording. But it's called Low Level. Oh, I don't know the Low Level something Pulaski.
Yeah, we'll put it in the description when we post it on YouTube.
Good. Yeah, I mean, somebody who puts that much time and effort into it, he deserves to. Be recognized for that work.
Absolutely. And Richard, just a little more trivia coming in tonight. He wants us to all remember the fire control on the Bismarck and the Prince of Wales were all analog. That's to be able to have that kind of precision from with no computer aided. It's all old school stuff.
Yeah, that's why the shell splashes and the bracketing were so important to the targeting. So they could see them, so they were so visible. And I love the movie because the model making in the movie the models that they show in Sink the Bismarck are really well done. It's about the best you can get at the time. I remember watching or reading some of In Harm's Way, and John Wayne and Kirk Douglas, they were so disappointed in the model making at the end of the movie. It looked like crap, and they wanted to actually pay to have it redone. But
really?
Bismarck looks great. I think their models are very realistic looking, the shell splashes and the sound effects. It's good stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe we need it done in 3D in the modern age.
There you go. And I have not seen the movie in years, but just watching the trailer again and looking at the miniatures, I was like, wow, this was for 1960. This was really, really good because, like you said, In Harm's Way and some of the other movies that came out even later in the 60s didn't look very good at all, especially compared to Sink the Bismarck.
Yeah. So I may go, and I have a few models I haven't finished yet. I had one of the Bismarck sinking and another one of the PBY. I'm going to go work on them, but maybe my website was on one of the slides earlier.
Yep.
Oh, that's right there too. I'm going to post stuff on my website or on Facebook as I finish it.
Good. Yeah. Please.
Stuff. It's like having a internet garage full of your artwork, you know.
Yeah, go to Con's website and you can see some of his work, shortfuse3d.com, and and you've got your email address up there. So I guess you're open to taking questions from people about 3D modeling and maybe how to get started or how to make it better.
And just a plug for the CAF. I mean, the CAF, I've always said, other than getting married to my wife and LASIK surgery, maybe it was one of the best things I've ever done in my life. And I've got so many bucket list items filled, and Fifi and Lil are incredible. They've had a really good tour season. So if you want to take the next level, take a Warbird ride or go out and see these planes or join up. Then
there you go.
It inspires you to do more things like this too, because you're around it a lot more.
Absolutely. Yes. And to find out where the tours are or how to become a member or just to donate, just go to commemorativeairforce.org. Commemorative Air Force, all one big long word, .org. Well, Con, thank you for spending some time with us tonight and sharing the recollections of the sinking of the Bismarck and also some of your 3D artwork. It's great looking stuff.
Enjoyed it. I'll be back when I have something new.
Okay. Sounds good. We'll book it. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Again, don't forget to click the like, subscribe, or follow button so we can let you know about future shows. And if you have any ideas for a future topic, something you'd like to hear about, just send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Thank you again to Con Kelley, and we will see you all next time on Commemorative Air Force's Warbird Tube. I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.